New Orleans was never supposed to exist. Half the city sits below sea level, surrounded on nearly every side by water. Lake Pontchartrain to the north, the Mississippi River to the south, swampland stretching in every direction. For almost 300 years, the only thing standing between that city and the water was a system of walls. And on August 29, 2005, those walls broke. But the catastrophe did not begin on August 29th. It began 6 days earlier, on August 23rd, when a tropical depression quietly formed over the southeastern Bahamas. Within 24 hours, it had strengthened into a tropical storm and was given a name that would become permanently etched into American memory. Katrina. On August 25th, the storm made its first landfall in southeastern Florida as a Category 1 hurricane. It crossed the tip of the peninsula in 6 hours, dropping over 10 inches of rain and flooding roads across Miami-Dade County. 14 people in Florida lost their lives, but Katrina was far from finished. As it entered the Gulf of Mexico, everything changed. The warm waters of the Gulf acted like rocket fuel. Within 48 hours, Katrina intensified from a Category 1 to a Category 5 hurricane, with sustained winds reaching 175 miles per hour. Its central pressure dropped to 902 millibars, making it one of the most intense Atlantic hurricanes ever measured. On August 28th, with the storm barreling toward the Louisiana coast, New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin stood at a news conference and announced the first mandatory evacuation in the city's history. He called Katrina a storm that most of us have long feared. An estimated 80% of the greater New Orleans population, roughly 1 million people, managed to evacuate. But that left behind approximately 100,000 residents. Many of them were elderly, disabled, or simply too poor to leave. They had no cars, no money for gas, nowhere to go. The city designated the Louisiana Superdome as a refuge of last resort and told those who could not leave to go there. By the evening of August 28th, roughly 26,000 people had packed into the stadium, carrying what little they could. At 6:10 on the morning of August 29th, Katrina made its second landfall near Burris, Louisiana, as a Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds of 125 miles per hour. The eye of the storm passed just east of New Orleans. For a brief moment, officials believed the city had been spared a direct hit. That belief lasted less than an hour. Before dawn, the storm surge had already begun pushing water against the levees protecting the city. At approximately 5 in the morning, the flood wall along the 17th Street Canal, the city's largest drainage canal, failed. The wall did not simply get overtopped by water. It lurched away from its foundation. Engineers would later discover that the soil beneath the wall contained a layer of soft clay that could not hold under pressure. The wall shifted, the earth gave way, and Lake Pontchartrain began pouring into the Lakeview neighborhood through a gap that eventually widened to 450 feet. By 6:30, the industrial canal on the eastern side of the city also breached. A wall of water surged into the lower Ninth Ward, a dense neighborhood of primarily working-class homeowners. The force was so violent that it did not just flood homes, it ripped them from their foundations and carried them down the street. A large industrial barge was swept through the breach and into the neighborhood, leveling houses beneath it. A second breach opened a few blocks south, widening to over 1,000 feet. The entire lower Ninth Ward was submerged under more than 10 feet of water. At nearly the same time, the London Avenue Canal breached on both sides, flooding the Gentilly and Fillmore neighborhoods. In total, more than 50 breaches occurred across the levee and floodwall system. By August 31st, 80% of New Orleans was underwater. Some areas were submerged under 15 feet. 3 million people across the Gulf Coast lost electricity. The American Society of Civil Engineers would later call it the worst engineering catastrophe in United States history. Inside the Superdome, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The storm had torn large sections of the roof membrane away, and water began leaking onto the people sheltered below. The power had not been fully lost, but the generators could not keep the air conditioning running for the entire building. The temperature inside climbed in the August heat. The plumbing failed as floodwaters backed up the sewage system. Every restroom in the building overflowed. Food and water supplies ran dangerously low. People slept on the concrete, on the field, in the seats, wherever they could find space. Outside, the Superdome was worse. The streets had become rivers. People who had stayed in their homes were now trapped. In the lower Ninth Ward and other low-lying neighborhoods, the water had risen so fast that many residents had no time to get out. Families broke through their own rooftops with axes, hammers, anything they could find, and climbed onto the shingles to wait for rescue. Across the city, thousands of people sat on rooftops in the sweltering Louisiana heat, waving shirts and bedsheets at any helicopter that passed overhead. The Coast Guard launched what would become the largest search and rescue operation in its history. Helicopter crews flew non-stop, lowering baskets to pull people off rooftops, out of attics, off the tops of cars. Over the following days, the Coast Guard alone rescued more than 33,000 people. But for many, help did not come fast enough. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Charity Hospital, one of the oldest public hospitals in the country, lost power entirely. The staff had no electricity, no running water, and no way to communicate with the outside world. Doctors and nurses hand-ventilated patients who were on life support, pumping air into their lungs manually for hours and then days. When no evacuation came, the staff organized a rooftop rescue operation of their own, carrying patients up darkened stairwells and onto the roof to be airlifted out. They refused to leave until every last patient was evacuated. It took 5 days. The federal response drew intense criticism. FEMA, the agency tasked with managing the disaster, was widely seen as slow and disorganized. Director Michael Brown would later resign over his handling of the crisis. Supplies that had been pre-staged in nearby states were delayed by logistical failures and poor coordination. For days, tens of thousands of people at the Superdome and the Convention Center waited with minimal food, water, or medical care. Along the Mississippi coast, the devastation was equally staggering. The cities of Gulfport, Biloxi, and Waveland were hit with a storm surge that reached 28 feet above normal tide levels in some areas. Entire blocks of beachfront homes and businesses were erased. Casinos that had floated on barges along the coast were ripped from their moorings and thrown hundreds of feet inland. In Waveland, the town was virtually leveled. In Pass Christian, nearly every structure within half a mile of the shoreline was destroyed. Back in New Orleans, the floodwaters did not begin to recede for weeks. When they finally did, what they revealed was staggering. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to debris fields. Cars were stacked on top of each other. Trees were stripped bare. A water line stained every building, marking exactly how high the water had reached. In the lower Ninth Ward, some homes had been carried blocks from where they once stood. Others had simply vanished. The scope of the human loss was enormous. The death toll, depending on the source, ranges from approximately 1,300 to over 1,800 people. The majority of victims were elderly residents who had been unable to evacuate and were found in their homes. Over 200,000 homes were severely damaged or destroyed. Approximately 800,000 people were displaced, the largest displacement in the United States since the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. More than 400,000 residents ultimately never returned to the city. Over 5,000 children were separated from their families during the chaos. The last child was not reunited until April of 2006, more than 7 months after the storm. The financial toll reached $125 billion, making Katrina the costliest natural disaster in American history at the time. Debris from the storm covered 90,000 square miles, an area nearly the size of the United Kingdom. But in the ruins, there were also extraordinary acts of courage. A former Marine named John Keller was trapped with nearly 240 other residents in his apartment building when the floodwaters surrounded them. For 5 days, no rescue came. Keller took charge. He hot-wired abandoned boats and used them to ferry residents to higher ground where helicopters could reach them. He stayed until every single person in the building had been evacuated. In the years that followed, the federal government spent over $14 billion rebuilding the levee system from scratch. The new system, renamed the Hurricane and Storm Damage Risk Reduction System, was designed to provide a 100-year level of flood protection. The Superdome was repaired at a cost of $336 million. And on September 25, 2006, the New Orleans Saints played their first home game since the storm, beating the Atlanta Falcons 23-3 in front of a packed crowd. For many in that stadium, it was the first moment they truly believed their city would survive. New Orleans has rebuilt. The French Quarter and the Garden District, which sit on higher ground, escaped the worst of the flooding and still pulse with the music and culture the city is known for. But the lower Ninth Ward, 2 decades later, remains largely empty. Vacant lots sit where homes once stood. Foundations and concrete slabs mark where families once lived. The population of the neighborhood, which was over 14,000 before the storm, has never fully recovered. What happened in New Orleans was not simply a natural disaster. The hurricane provided the force, but the flooding that drowned the city was caused by walls that were built to protect it and failed. Walls that engineers later determined had never been strong enough to do what they were designed to do. Katrina did not just expose the power of nature. It exposed what happens when the systems built to protect people are not built well enough, and when the people left behind are the ones with the least ability to save themselves. August 29, 2005, left a scar on the United States that is still visible today. Not just in the empty lots of the lower Ninth Ward, but in the memory of a nation that watched its own citizens stranded on rooftops, waiting for help that took far too long to arrive.